You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. My guest today is going to talk about a subject that we don't often like to talk about, but she's going to help us normalize and appreciate why it's important to have these discussions, because it's a matter of human dignity. My guest today is Kimberly Callinan, who is the president and CEO of Compassion and Choices. Kimberly, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Thanks, Art. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Kimberly, tell us about the work of Compassion and Choices.
Sure. So Compassion and Choices is the largest national nonprofit organization that's devoted exclusively to improving care and expanding options at the end of life. Quite simply, what we're trying to do is help more people end their lives the way that they want to, with comfort and peace and dignity, however they define that. But interestingly, I would say that my job, my role in our organization is as much, if not more, about living than it is about how one dies.
Say more about that. Much
Sure.
about living as it is how someone dies. Say more about that.
So, right now we live in this society where people are afraid to have conversations about how you die. We really are a very death-phobic culture. And what I get to see in my work is that when a person chooses to embrace their mortality and becomes really comfortable with the fact that their time on this earth is short, that it proves to be a gift because they live their life more fully with more intentionality and they have a far greater impact. And so if we are able to not just normalize end of life, but if we're able to get people to recognize that there is a treasure in end of life planning, and that treasure is a life fully lived, as well as a legacy of love and completion that you leave behind for your loved ones, I think we can completely change not just how people die, but how people live.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Kimberly, though you must still come across people, as you say, who are very, very death phobic.
Absolutely.
And what are some of the ways in which you help, I would say, us get over that phobia?
Yeah. So I guess I would say if you think about, think a little bit about what worries you about death. And you can't actually change it. There's very few things in our life that are 100% certain. And it is 100% certain that you are going to die. There's no question. Like, we haven't, figured out how to cure death. And we probably never will. And so given that, I would challenge you that being afraid of death actually makes you live a far less complete life. So ask yourself, what would be different about your life? What would you do differently if you knew that you were going to die tomorrow or that you were going to die in 6 months? And what's really empowering for me is that I get the privilege of being around these incredible terminally ill advocates who embrace their mortality and they're leaving a legacy behind, and that they inspire me to live my life differently. They don't show fear anymore, because what do they have to be afraid of? They're not going to be around. They don't let little things like the toothpaste in the sink that your husband didn't do, they don't let those things bother them. And they become really clear about what's important. So all of those things that like the stories that we make up that stop us from being our complete full selves and having the kind of impact we want in the time that we're there. If someone is willing to embrace their mortality, those things go away. And so what are you giving up? I guess I would challenge you that you are giving up life by being afraid to contemplate death.
Kimberly, how did you choose this as a mission and a way to give back to society, I guess I should say?
Yeah. So I had two experiences in death that really shaped this as an important issue for me. The first experience was a grandmother who had an advance directive that wasn't honored, and she died in the hospital. And it looked like you could see on her face, the upset that she felt over being violated at the very end. And there was a lot of guilt that the family carried over how she died and the incompleteness that we felt about it. Then fast forward about 10 years, and by then my mother was a hospice social worker, and my grandfather died the most, if you can consider death to be beautiful, his death was beautiful. He had loved ones we were all surrounding him. He had a chance to say goodbye to us. There was nothing left unsaid. It was a gift to me. And when I juxtapose how my grandfather died to how my grandmother died, it made me realize that how one dies matters not just to the dying person, but to those who are left behind. And so that called on me to really contribute to this movement that brings death out of the shadows and also ensures that people have access to the full range of options so they can choose how and when they die, if that's a possibility for them and a desire for them.
So do states handle the legal aspects of this differently? Talk about that some.
Yeah. So at a federal level, we all have a certain set of rights. You have the right to refuse treatment. You have the right to as much pain medication as you need to be comfortable, although that's not always honored, but you should have that right at the end of life. You have, their hospice care is available in every single state. You have the right to voluntarily stop eating and drinking if you are terminally ill. You don't have to accept feeding tubes. So there's a whole range of options and rights that people have when their time comes and they're ready to die. However, on a state-by-state level, the option of medical aid in dying is only available in 10 states and Washington, D.C. And medical aid in dying is the option for a person who is terminally ill and mentally capable, who has a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, the ability to request from their doctor and receive medication that allows them to die at a manner and time of their choosing. And the option itself, very few people will choose to use the option. It's a highly, highly regulated practice. So it's been around now for many, many years. We're decades in Oregon. Its first was implemented in 1997 and across states. So we have lots of data. It's highly regulated. There's no abuse. There's no coercion. And it is patient-directed from start to finish. We know that a very small number of people will choose the option, but the vast majority of people want the option because they believe they've had the ability to make healthcare decisions their entire life, and that option being available to them is important in allowing them the control at a time when you're losing control and when so much is being taken away. The option being available provides profound peace of mind to people. It also, the data shows that it results in improved conversations between doctors and patients, better palliative care, and earlier enrollment into hospice care. So even people who don't choose the option end up benefiting because it contributes to improvements in other end-of-life care options.
So now if a person chooses that option, what are the circumstances generally surrounding their desire to take that option?
So I think for most people, and again, it's fewer than 1% of the people choose it. For most people, they have a fear of the pain that comes with death. And or they have a desire. A lot of the people who use it have cancer. They have a desire to try one more treatment option, but the treatments themselves are causing a tremendous amount of pain and suffering, and they don't want to continue inflicting. I mean, you're putting poison in your body when you do immunotherapy and chemotherapy. And of course, the poison works sometimes and it kills the cancer, but many times it does not, and it leaves your body more devastated. And so they want to know that if they try that last experimental treatment and it really does devastate their body, that they have a way out that allows them to not go through suffering. We often say it allows people to avoid the very worst, the very last part of the dying process. So if you've been around somebody who has has a slower death, you could have the last 2 weeks of someone's life, if they have one of the illnesses that causes a lot of pain and suffering, can be very challenging. And all the pain medication in the world is not alleviating the symptoms. And so people will use it to be able to control those symptoms and avoid the worst part. And then some people want their loved ones to see them die before they have kind of reached a point where they no longer are like themselves. So they're still only cutting a short amount off of their life, but for them, that's what a dignified death looks like.
You mentioned that people who choose this option is a small percentage, and yet there's some opposition to it, obviously. What are some of the claims that people make about why you shouldn't have this option at the end of your life?
I think the biggest opposition comes from the Catholic Church, not Catholics themselves. 70% of Catholics support the option, but the Catholic Church and evangelical fundamentalists, or I would say the two groups that are the biggest opponents. And it comes from moral beliefs that God gave us life and God's the only one that should be able to take it away. And we are 100% supportive and fully believe that people should be able to follow their own religious beliefs. So this is not an option that we would ever say any person has to take, but it is an option that we believe strongly people should have the option to take. And so while I respect that it is counter to some group of people's fundamental values, it's not something that's required for them to use. And our belief is that it should be available to those people who want it.
Yeah. What are some of the, what will happen to a person who decides that they want to use it? Again, it's only 1%.
Yeah.
So are they given certain drugs that are not going to be painful to them, and it reduces what we know about their suffering at those last moments?
Yeah. So first, it's important to know they go through a very rigorous process to get to the point where they can even get the prescription. So they have to see, in most states, 2 providers have to certify that they meet the eligibility criteria. They're terminally ill, mentally capable, prognosis of 6 months or less to live, and are able to take the medication themselves. There's witness forms, there's attestation forms. So there's a very rigorous process. When they get through that process and they eventually have the prescription in hand, about 1/3 of people choose not to take it at all. They simply get the peace of mind knowing the option is available. For the 2/3 of people who do eventually decide that they want to take the medication, some of them hang on to that for quite a while. And when they determine that their pain and suffering is too great, they can choose to take it. And on the day that they decide to take it, many people choose that they want to be by themselves with their loved ones, and they have a family member who mixes the medication. Other people want a clinician or somebody present, and that's the dying person's decision. But basically, you get powder in a bottle. And it gets mixed with about 4 ounces of typically orange juice, and it's mixed together. A person is given medications about 30 minutes before they are going to take the medication to relax them and make sure that everything is okay. And then they either sip the medication typically from a straw So they have to be able to take an act, or if they can no longer swallow, it can be a feeding tube that is being a plunger. They can push a plunger. So there's a couple of different administration methods, and the doctor would decide what the best one is in advance. And then after the person completes the medication, typically they fall asleep within about an hour, and their heart rate just is slowing down. And then eventually they stop breathing and die. It's very peaceful typically. On average, it's 2 hours, but if someone is younger and healthier, it could take longer. But the person is typically asleep. They look like they're sleeping. So we will say to people, the dying person, like, talk about what you want your loved ones to do during that period of time, so that it's sort of a special time together, as opposed to staring and waiting at a clock for, your person to stop breathing. But it is far more peaceful if you think about the normal experience at the end of life for someone who has a prolonged death. I mean, that last couple of things, instead of it being 2 to 4 hours of, kind of waiting, that can go on where a person is in pain and they're, suffering and they're uncomfortable, and that can go on for weeks. And so it really takes away the very end of what can sometimes be a difficult and challenging process.
This is really interesting because so much of the work we do in nonprofits are geared towards helping people live better and more fulfilling lives. And yet there is an element to what you're doing that obviously isn't going to help them live longer lives, but will certainly improve what's remaining of the quality, I guess, of their lives and their, I guess, perception of what life is all about to some extent, which is to give you a certain degree of control over your life. And there's a certain degree of comfort, I guess, in knowing that you have some control over your life. Is that part of the stance that you all have?
It's absolutely, and it's what the evidence shows happen. So there was one very famous story with Brittany Menard. She's was a 29-year-old woman who moved from California to Oregon in order to access the option, and she and her husband Dan partnered with us to share her story. This was back in 2015. And 2014, I think it started, and then into 2015. And she talked about how the moment she got the prescription, she was able to live her life to the fullest. She went out hiking. She went and made a final visit with her girlfriend, with her mother, with her husband. And she was young enough when she got her terminal diagnosis that she still had energy at some point. But then she declined. And, eventually she hit that point where she no longer had quality of life for her. But the time that she had left was filled with her living as long as she possibly could, until for her there was no more quality of life left. And we see that over and over and over and over again with our storytellers.
The thoughts that go through your mind when you find out you have so little time is everything that you need to say to everyone that you love. And then I was diagnosed this past New Year's. We went away to the wine country for kind of a New Year's Eve celebration, and by Jan 1, the following day, I was diagnosed with cancer and told I was terminally ill. My parents spent a couple months, they just wanted to search for a miracle. I plan to be surrounded by my immediate family, which is my husband and my mother and my stepfather and my best friend, who's also a physician, and probably not much more people. And I will die upstairs in my bedroom that I share with my husband, with my mother and my husband by my side, and pass peacefully with some music that I like in the background. I can't even tell you the amount of relief that it provides me to know that I don't have to die the way that it's been described to me that my brain tumor would take me on its own.
Death with dignity allows for people who are in the predicament of facing a lot of suffering, that they can decide when enough is enough.
Since becoming ill, I have traveled and continued. My husband and I took a beautiful trip to Yellowstone. It was exquisite. And then I went with my best friend to Alaska, and we went to Denali National Park, and we went to Seaward and Kenai Fjords and kayaked up to the glaciers. And then I met my mother in Juneau, and we took this spectacular boat trip. Before I pass, I'm hoping to make it to the Grand Canyon because I've never been. And that's all I can do is set little goals like that. And all those things make every day worthwhile. I hope to enjoy however many days I have left on this beautiful earth and spend as much of it outside as I can, surrounded by those I love. I hope to pass in peace. The reason to consider life and what's of value is to make sure you're not missing out. Seize the day. What's important to you? What do you care about? What matters? Pursue that. Forget the rest.
The other piece that's really important that I think people think of the decisions that happen at the end of life in a very binary way. You're either fighting till the end or you're giving up, I think is the narrative that's out there. And I think it's an unfortunate and untruthful narrative because the reality is you're making a whole host of treatment decisions that are typically happening to a person if they're not asking what the implication of this is. And you don't recognize that the treatments that you're taking have side effects that are impacting your quality of life, and they may or may not increase the length of your life. But those decisions all too often are being made for a person by a provider. And it's not, it's not like they're trying to hide anything. It all happens so quickly. People assume the goal of care is about the extension of life. And the conversations that need to be happening don't take place unless a patient is really informed and learns to ask the right questions. Or you end up with palliative care and a doctor that is just phenomenal at knowing how to talk about this. And so part of what we do is we really teach people how to be an informed consumer. So you're making decisions about the care you get that are in line with what's most important to you. And I'll share one, and so many people who come to our movement are the family members of somebody, and the story that the words they open up with was, I realized after the fact that the medicine itself is what was causing all of the suffering, and I wish I understood now what I understand now. And so we try to get the word out about the importance of really understanding that it has to be a partnership between the clinicians and the dying person and whoever is their advocate or proxy or whatever word you use in that state, because it's different everywhere, because the clinician is the expert on what are the care options that are available to a person. But it's the dying person that's the expert on what's quality of life mean to me and can make a decision about, do I want to take the lottery on this really experimental treatment that has never worked on anybody and is likely to cause this set of side effects because there's a chance it could make me live, but I'm going to have a whole host of side effects with, so however long I live, I no longer have quality of life? Or do I want to choose a different treatment option where I could have 6 months or 12 months of great quality of life, but I will then die? And that's not how it's typically presented to people. And so they enter into treatments that cause a tremendous amount of suffering. And sometimes they even reduce the length of life, and they definitely reduce the quality of life. And I'll share one story that really, I think, articulates this so well, which is a woman called me, a daughter called me up, and she was hysterical in tears, and she found out about Compassion and Choices after her mother had died. And she said to me, I have a brand new baby and my mother never got a chance to hold her. because the doctor did not, she was dying and she was on all kinds of treatment options for cancer. The doctor did not tell her that the treatment she was about to agree to, which was experimental and was not likely to work, was going to mean she'd never be able to carry her grandchild. And so she gave up the option to hold her grandchild before she died, unknowingly. And that's the kind of story that happens over and over and over again. And I would love it if people could recognize like two things. One is that the fear of death is stopping you from living your life to the fullest. And the second is, when you embrace your mortality and you become really comfortable with the fact that you're going to die, you're going to give a gift to your loved ones, because they will have clarity on what it means to care for you at the end, and they won't be riddled with guilt over what care decisions they should make and what treatment options you might want.
Kimberly, this is so interesting. One of the things that's coming to mind now are some of the economics around this.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine if you take a certain course of action, it's going to be a lot more expensive. Not that maybe that shouldn't be the big issue here.
Yeah.
But if people want to take that option and save their families and maybe save the system significant amounts of dollars, maybe they should have that right. Does economics come into play here? And I guess the other question is, should we be careful that people don't make the decision simply because of economics?
Yeah. So it's interesting when you're talking about the option of medical aid in dying, what the studies show is that economics typically is not coming into play, because the data shows that it's reducing someone's life by typically 7 days, and they are already enrolled in hospice care, and hospice is covered through Medicare. So the economics really don't come into play, although I think that is definitely one of the concerns that people have around abuse and coercion, but the data just doesn't support that the economics are coming into play. That said, I do think the economics come into play potentially on the other side, which is that we have such a strong bend towards trying one last treatment, and towards like this idea that like medicine should be able to cure everything and that there is an answer. And when you have insurance in the middle of that, and you have some people with good insurance and some people with bad insurance, and people see kind of giving up as failure, and no one's having conversations about the economics that are at play. I think there could be times when providers are motivated from an economic perspective to continue to try more things. They get money when they do that. And I'm not suggesting this is widespread, but there is the potential that some continued treatments happen for that reason. And then I think, there are a tremendous amount of inequities that exist within the healthcare coverage that people receive. So there's no question that, and you have a long history of people who want more care, not being able to get care, fighting for that their entire lives, and then getting to the end of life. And then there's this inequity now where there's no conversation and no trust within the healthcare system. And then they end up people end up not going onto hospice care because they feel like that's people giving up, when in fact hospice care provides a level of support to people who are in that situation where they're going to die. So I think the economics of it does come into play in a lot of different ways and is very complicated. But it doesn't serve as a motivator for people to use medical aid in dying.
Yeah. Kimberly, how about your organization itself? How is it supported? And what particular programs are you launching? We talked a lot about the issue itself. How about your organization? How does it work?
So we are an entirely, a movement that gets all of its funding from individuals, either alive or people who leave us legacy gifts. We get a pretty large percentage of our giving comes in the form of legacy gifts. I think people often get to the end of their life, and then they realize how important the issue is. And then there's a level of, oh, wow, like I've missed 20 years of contributing to this issue. Let me make up for that through a nice legacy gift. And so we get, people throughout their life. And at the end, we don't get a lot of corporate funding because I don't think ours is a warm, fuzzy issue. We get some family foundations where it's really more like an individual giver. The larger family foundations, often the issue of medical aid in dying is seen as controversial. So that's not something that a lot of the larger foundations fund. So it's really, we're funded by individuals. We have all individual supporters, but a lot of them, because we're now up to about almost a $25 million organization. So, it's not dissimilar to, we're often viewed as the like complementary issue to reproductive rights, where, early in a woman's life, they're focused on bodily autonomy. And then later on, there's this realization of, oh, wow, like I fought for bodily autonomy during my life, but now I get to the end of my life and now my bodily autonomy is being taken away.
What's your sense? Is the movement gaining steam, or is it something that's kind of stuck where it is?
Oh, no, we are gaining tremendous steam. Since 2015, when Brittany came forward and shared her story with Dan, we have authorized or improved legislation in a state every single year. So we're now up to 10 states in Washington, D.C. that have authorized this option. And if you look at the data, Oregon was in 1997, and then it took 10 years for the next state to authorize, which was Washington State. And then you had kind of Montana and Vermont after that. And since then, it's been kind of a state a year. We have a bill right now sitting on the governor's desk in Delaware. So that's a possibility for this year. We also improved a bill in Colorado this year. So the movement specifically around medical aid in dying is gaining tremendous traction. And of course, we at Compassionate Choices work more broadly on the issue. Medical aid in dying is one program, but we also work on how people normalizing advanced directives for people with dementia. We work on integrating palliative care into emergency department settings so that people are having the conversations earlier during the point that care is being given, and often those critical conversations aren't happening. We work on addressing the inequities in care, some of the things that we talked about earlier, and have got some good regulatory changes implemented, particularly around telehealth, that really do help to address some of the inequities that exist. And then we have a whole business line that's around empowering individuals around the kind of care they want, where we have free tools and resources. And we do a lot of promotion around why it's important to talk about the end of life. And if I compare, so I've been with the organization for almost 10 years. If I compare to where we were when I started in the organization, you couldn't get anyone to talk about death. Like, it was such a taboo topic. And now every time I open up, I go online and I go onto Netflix, there is a new documentary that is addressing the topic of death and dying, or it's in a sitcom, and someone addresses the issue around end of life, whether it's overtreatment or medical aid in dying. And so the topic is out there, and I think it's coming because of that shift in the demographic shift, where baby boomers are now, contemplating their own mortality while caring for their aging parents. And they recognize that as our medical care system has evolved and we have gotten really, really, really good at prolonging life, there is now this imbalance between, life-saving treatments and recognizing and preparing somebody for their death. And so I think, given the demographic shift that's taking place in the country, and of course our amazing work and the amazing work of other people, I believe that we are on a trajectory for continued progress. The organization has grown from $12 million annually to nearly 25 million since in the period of time that I've been the CEO, and that is well, I think I'm a great CEO. It's not because I'm the CEO. It is because of the issue and, the importance and the increased awareness, and the great work that the team is doing. And, we're going to continue to grow and continue to make progress. And I think, in 10 or 15 years, my hope is that people our culture sees the embracement of their mortality as a treasure instead of as traumatic.
Well, Kimberly, we're kind of at the end now, but I do want to ask you one last question about how you measure your success. Now, you've given us a lot of interesting statistics around how you've grown, but are those the key measurements that you would put to us to demonstrate your impact and your results?
No, I mean, I think the growth in the organization is what allows us to have impact. So, our impact is passing new laws, improving legislation that's out there. And, I talked about the legislation, the laws that we've passed specifically around medical aid and dying. We've had some similar success stories on the federal level around regulatory policies that have been improved, telehealth. So, laws is one way. How the clinical practice of medicine views the patient's role within medical care is another way that we look at the progress we're making. So you're seeing we have a lot more health systems that have adopted policies that are supportive of patients having a voice and choice in the kind of care they received. So we use that as a measure of success. And then on the empowerment front, it's about, the number of people that we are fully empowering to take charge of their end of life. And we're actually in the process of figuring out what that metric looks like. Of course, we look at advanced directives and are you increasing the number of people that are filling those out? But advanced directives are not enough. You really need people to move their approach to how they plan for the end. So the distribution of the materials and the tools is our starting point, but we're trying to be more rigorous around a metric that evaluates that.
So, Kimberly, tell us about how we can get more information about the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. So the easiest thing to do is to go to our website. It is compassionandchoices.org. And it's chock full of information. And I strongly encourage you to use our end-of-life planning tools, and in particular, our dementia values and priorities tool, as that can completely transform how you die with dementia, and it is a gift to your loved one. So I hope you'll go online, check us out, and learn more about Compassion and Choices, and get involved, because we are a movement of individual people that recognize the importance of embracing the inevitability of death. Thank you.
Well, look, Kimberly, I'm really appreciative that you stopped by to have this talk with me. And obviously, this is, as you say, a controversial subject that may be waning in the area of controversy over time. Yeah. So I know you're happy about that. And I know that our listeners have picked up a lot of important information, and maybe will begin thinking about how they want to end their own lives legally and with dignity. So thank you for this. And I want to just say to all of those who are listening in for the first time, this is the Heart of Giving podcast. We are a weekly show. You are listening to our 201st episode. And we're bringing you these shows so that you can get a better sense of what's going on in the nonprofit space, maybe give you ideas for how you can create impact. And I hope you'll be a regular listener by checking in on YouTube or any of our major podcast platforms. And we'll appreciate that. If you want to support the podcast, you can do that by simply going to give.org and making a contribution. We would really appreciate it and put it to great use. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests. not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.